Mode.
Good afternoon. My name is John Stoltz, Director of Conferences and Events for APICS, and I will be your host for today's webinar. We are pleased to be joined by Irv Marconi and Jeffrey Brown for today's program, Humanitarian Logistics and the Military. Irv and Jeffrey are featured presenters for the APICS 2016 conference, scheduled for September 25th through 27th in Washington, D.C., and we are pleased to have them joining us today with a preview of the great content that will be featured at the conference. APICS 2016 is the premier conference for end-to-end supply chain management professionals. The conference takes place over 3 days and offers attendees more than 65 educational sessions to select from, as well as a variety of additional learning events that attendees can experience. This year's conference will be attended by more than 2,000 supply chain management professionals and features a robust educational program with the newly expanded Distribution and Logistics Learning Path. Today's webinar is one of 13 educational sessions included in that learning path. The session titles are listed on the slide for you. As a special bonus, we've also included an offer for webinar attendees today to save $50 on a full conference registration. The RSVP code is displayed on the screen and will also be included in our follow-up email communication. Additionally, participation in today's webinar qualifies as one elective hour towards the APICS Risk Management Education Certificate. Please visit www.apics.org/risk to learn more about the certificate program. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few logistical details with you. At the end of the presentation, we will save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a question box. To ask your question, simply type it in the designated box and select Send Question to Staff to send at any time during the presentation. Those of you viewing this program in a room with several participants may want to designate one person to type in the questions from the group. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted online at apics.org. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today's broadcast, Irv and Jeffrey.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeffrey Brown, as mentioned, one of the speakers for today's webinar and also for the conference, 25th and the 27th of September. By way of introduction, I'm a retired Navy Supply Corps officer. My last post, an active duty, was at Joint Forces Headquarters National Capital Region at Fort McNair. That's a sub-command of U.S. Northern Command, which you'll hear about a little bit later. Currently, I work at the Navy Yard as a senior contract specialist supporting PEO EIS. Irv?
Thank you, Jeffrey and John. This is Irvin Marconi. Pleased to meet everyone on this webinar. I am an instructor, master instructor for the APICS DC Metro chapter here in Washington, D.C. We look forward to having all of you come to Washington. My background has been in logistics and transportation and working the last several years in supply chain risk management, teaching at the university level as well as teaching courses for APICS and for our various clients, including the Veterans Affairs Administration. And the subject of supply chain risk has increasingly come into my world, and so I've been able to advance in here and both educate myself and hopefully educate others as well on this topic. So thank you again for all of us for joining and for the instructions from John. We will cover a few issues today. Let me explain here that the agenda we have here for you will be similar, but it is condensed to what we will be presenting at APICS 2016 come next month. But we'll hopefully be able to give you enough to interest you to come and see the full presentation that we'll have at APICS Washington. So today, and at the conference, we'll talk about the dynamics of humanitarian logistics, what it entails, differences between humanitarian logistics and non-disaster logistics, the government's national response plan and the mission of the Department of Defense that were recently put together after a series of disasters that our country experienced. 3, the role of commercial supply chain partners in the support of DoD humanitarian logistics, some comparison of best practices. 4. We'll talk a little bit about Hurricane Sandy, but most of the case study that we have prepared for you will be given at the longer version at APICS. So we'll just mention a few highlights from research at Hurricane Sandy. Important lessons for the future based on these events, as well as research that others have done in the area of disaster logistics. And we'll certainly have room and time for questions and answers. I hope that all of you will be free to encourage to ask them. And those that perhaps we can't answer here will be able to answer by email. And we obviously look forward to seeing you in Washington. This is certainly connected to the new certification that APICS has created, Certified Logistics Transportation and Distribution. The Humanitarian Logistics is certainly about logistics, and skill sets that we can gain in CLTD will be very appropriate for those working in humanitarian logistics. So Hurricane Sandy was not a very powerful storm, despite all the damage that it did, as it was being tracked from the Caribbean up the eastern coast. It was at times a very high-powered, high-category storm, but when it actually made landfall, it was actually only a Category 1. It had tracks to go both to the Carolinas, Virginia, but also had various tracks to go as far north as Nova Scotia. But it happened to cross and make a left turn as it approached New York City and New Jersey, and it had devastating results. But in truth, it was only a Category 1 hurricane on a scale of 1 to 5. It was certainly from the least powerful type of hurricane. So there were various warnings, but preparations, were they adequate? It turned out not to be. There were many deaths that came from the hurricane, and some $50 billion of damage. Most of it was in the New York metropolitan area, but damage from the hurricane was as far north as upstate New York and the Canadian border, far west toward Ohio, throughout Virginia, tremendous amount of damage, but most of it was in those central part of the Northeast. So what goes on in a hurricane? In a hurricane, in a damage after a hurricane or any other type of disaster, tremendous things are occurring. The dynamics of humanitarian logistics forces us to look at the resources that we have available to us. We normally expect, if we're in distribution and transportation, to have gas for our equipment. But in fact, we had fuel shortages and gas stations literally were running out. We had to bring in additional resources, such as the National Guard, to supplement local resources, because as we'll discuss in this presentation, it is very problematic the amount of resources locally we will be able to have. We must encounter disruptions in transportation that we may not normally encounter, and here you see a picture of a road that collapsed. Thus, we must make plans for what will be alternate ways for distribution in the aftermath of the disaster. And the stakeholders in disaster are different than normal stakeholders in traditional logistics. Here, as you can see in the bottom right, we have government officials, the governor of New York, Senator Schumer from New York, and President Obama and other officials. These are the spokespeople or the stakeholders involved in humanitarian logistics. We don't normally get this kind of attention in traditional logistics, but we are dealing with a much wider set of stakeholders when we have a humanitarian logistics issue. The profession is, there is a disaster humanitarian logistics profession. There is one main association, as you can see on the screen, called Humanitarian Logistics Association, and they are a group of those who are involved in humanitarian logistics in a wide variety of organizations. What is humanitarian logistics? The process of planning, implementing, and controlling the efficient, cost-effective flow and storage of goods and materials, as well as related information from the point of origin to the point of consumption for the purpose of alleviating the suffering of vulnerable people. So we will see here that there are similarities and differences between humanitarian logistics and traditional non-disaster logistics. The differences are great, as they might be expected to be, but in fact the similarities are also there, telling us that logisticians are very capable of working with humanitarian logistics by understanding the differences that may occur between their traditional areas of work and humanitarian side of work. The United States government had to respond to disasters of the last 15 years. The disaster took place as a result of 9/11, but other natural disasters as well. Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans, which in itself also was not the most powerful hurricane. The damage that resulted from Katrina was the damage caused to the levees that allowed water to spill over. That's where so many terrible things occurred in New Orleans back in 2005. So based on that, the United States had realized that it did not have a sufficient national response framework that could bring together local, state, and federal officials, organizations, as well as the public, as well as the commercial sector. So the National Response Framework was developed along with other frameworks. It is now on its third edition, and it seeks to explain and demonstrate to all stakeholders involved ways of prevention, ways of protection, ways of mitigation, response, and recovery. So these are the 5 traditional steps that we use to organize ourselves to respond to disasters in an organized fashion. And that organized fashion means understanding of stakeholders, understanding of processes. The Department of Defense has become increasingly an organization that has had to assist in its responses because the ability of local and state resources and in fact other national sector resources has not been sufficient. So among things that the government has done is to develop a campaign, as you can see on the screen, called America's Prepareathon Campaign. The Prepareathon Campaign is a bi-yearly event of preparedness that takes place and is pronounced in April and September, which aims to increase individual and organizational preparedness, adding that such preparedness is synonymous with military readiness. So as Jeff will shortly explain, the Department of Defense has become the go-to organization to enable the nation to respond more effectively, more forcefully, and hopefully minimizing the losses that may take place for a variety of natural disasters. I want to point out to you the pictures that we have on the screen. The picture on the bottom left is the area where Jeff had been most recently stationed, Joint Forces Command, and here the various forces are together in terms of preparedness for a whole host of contingencies. This is located out at in the DC area at Fort McNair, and they're connected communication-wise to local, state, and national authorities. And it brings together really the power, excuse me, of the Defense Department, which Jeff will explain. In the middle, you'll see a social media guide for natural disaster response and recovery. Communication is a great challenge, always, in even traditional logistics, but in fact, it's an even greater challenge when we have disruption of communication among various stakeholders. So now FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, now has developed a social media guide for assistance in the event of natural disasters, leading to a greater response and more effective recovery. The picture on the bottom left is a picture of our infrastructure. So when our infrastructure has been designed, new roads and so forth, it was likely the expectation that we would need to consider disasters was not necessarily significant with transportation engineers. And as a result, much of our infrastructure has ended up being unable to fully allow an adequate response in the event of disaster. We have increasingly been able to alter some of our infrastructure, so we can now have flow or change flow, contraflow highways, so we can have all traffic moving out of a disaster area should that occur. But here's a picture where we haven't been able to do that. This definitely impacts humanitarian logistics in a way that we don't normally expect transportation or traffic in this case to do so. So we must in fact be able to work within these constraints in terms of the resources we have while we constantly try to improve them so we can have a greater response and a greater recovery. Nonetheless, we have constraints that I need to work on. So given all these constraints, the Department of Defense has come in and become a greater stakeholder in this process. So let me now turn it over to Jeff to explain more about how the military is assisting us. Jeff?
Hey, thank you, Irvin. I appreciate it. So it's kind of like politics. Most people are concerned with humanitarian logistics as it hits closer to home. So as such, we're going to talk about two commands that affect the Americas. The first is the U.S. Northern Command that was started in the wake of 9/11, established actually in October 2002 after we were attacked on 9/11, and we kind of found out that the military didn't really have a set command and control instructions for how we wanted to do command and control for this country. It wasn't controlled by then a combatant commander, so there was no set way to do that. So Northern Command was created to kind of fill that gap, and we'll talk about Southern Command in a second. But they kind of read very similar. Northern Command's vision is a little flowery, but essentially what they do is command and control, homeland defense, and defense support of civil authorities is kind of what they do. And Irv talked a little bit about defense and support of civil authorities, or DISCA, as they say. So with their trusted partners, they'll defend North America, outpacing all threats, maintaining the faith with the people, and in their times of greatest need. And they have a saying, we have the watch. For those of you that have served in the military, you've seen that, we have the watch kind of mantra. Southern Command is kind of very much same, the mirror of Northern Command, responsible for Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, except for U.S. territories and Commonwealth possessions. So they support U.S. national security objectives throughout the Western Hemisphere in cooperation with domestic international partners to foster security, ensure stability, and promote prosperity throughout Central and South America, Caribbean, and global communities. Kind of is how they go about doing that. And those partners will come in need or come in use if there is some kind of natural disaster, or a man-made disaster, or follow on to that. And I kind of want to make a kind of a note here that this is a relatively short webinar, and we really can't go into the depth that some of these topics can require. So obviously I implore you to come to the seminar. Even then, we can only go so deep. We've had several conferences where we've spent days looking at the command and control of a particular situation, a hypothetical situation that happens in North America, how the command and control works. So it's very complicated. So we'll look at a couple aspects of this and kind of let you know the things that the military can do in conjunction with our government agencies and our non-government agencies to aid and assist people. So we talked about FEMA a little bit earlier, but so and here we see General Jacoby, who was the then commander of U.S. Northern Command. He has since been relieved and his predecessor has been relieved as well. It's now General Laurie Robinson, who now has Northern Command and NORAD as well. So for locally, for example, in the National Capital Region, we'd have and that's we're going to look at this is using the existing structures and supply chains to kind of combat the situation. And there's other ways you can do that. You can make new supply chains and try to do new things, and that's a different tack we're not going to discuss today. We're trying to use what we have in existence and exercise the ability to use that. And we'll talk a little briefly about exercise that we do and have done in the area to prepare for a natural disaster of different sort. But it all, and Irv referred to this, it all goes through the ability of the local organization to handle the disaster. So that's always first, and often that doesn't happen just because of the nature of the disaster. It doesn't happen, and then the government can either step in voluntarily to help, or they can be requested to help. There's a request process. That's, I guess, another conference as well. But the military is expensive to ask for help, so you'll kind of want to use that as a last resort. And of course, local commanders can step in without being requested if life or limb or property is involved. They need to get in help so people don't get hurt or things don't get damaged. That's always an option for your local commanders, wherever they are. So, for example, in the National Capital Region, would be a joint. It would establish as a joint task force under NORTHCOM, and for this particular thing, the joint operations area for the Capital Region is Washington D.C. and several counties, it's established counties in Virginia and Maryland. So that's the joint operating area for the National Capital Region. So they would establish a joint contracting center would be the ultimate goal of what they would do to try and get things on contract to combat whatever the particular problem was. And you have to pick a disaster. It worked for Sandy. They had different needs than what you may have for the Washington, D.C. area. So the JCC will coordinate, Joint Contracting Command will coordinate theater support along with FEMA and using GSA, field contracting representatives, to kind of control the whole National Capital Region Joint Operating Area to see what they can get and use, not including the BSIs, Base Support Installations, which are designated by FEMA as far as where they're going to run the support for the area out of. So you coordinate among the theater support. The JCC will compose of contracting personnel from, this example, Air Force, District of Washington, and deployed contracting personnel from various services, either virtually or actually on their base. And what they would do is form a council with the local G4 and G2 and G1 and so forth, and the various J, as far as J codes, and you decide what needed to be purchased and try to figure out who had the ability to get that on station quickly. It's kind of things you do for local supply. But one of the things that we kind of do before we get into that niche items is go to DLA, Defense Logistics Agency, as you can see on the screen. They're located, headquartered on Fort Belvoir, side area of Fort Belvoir in Virginia. And they are a Department of Defense support contract agency, combat support agency. And they report to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness, as well as the Undersecretary for Defense and Acquisition, Technology and Logistics, ATL. And they do about $37 billion a year in goods and services. So obviously it's quite an extensive organization. They're responsible for contracting, purchasing, storing, and distributing most of the consumable and spendable repair items for DoD. Staff's about 25,000 people, and so they played very heavily in Hurricane Sandy relief and post-relief. Unfortunately for the folks that, Katrina and other disasters before that, there's been a learning lessons learned, and the support has improved with each subsequent disaster. So the response for Sandy was much better and more organized on many fronts than it was for, say, Katrina or some of the hurricanes we've had throughout the country up and down the coast. Those DLA requires multiple supply classes. So we're talking about textiles, food, energy projects, medical material, equipment, construction material, and industrial hardware, personal items, major end items, repair parts, and that kind of gets us to where we are with the support for us. DLA has three types of customers: deployed warfighters, non-deployed warfighters, and U.S. government agencies and particular militaries, partner militaries. So FEMA is one of those organizations, as is Department of Homeland Security. So they already have relationships with DLA to supply things that they need in the event of emergency. And then for a coming emergency, you start to ask for more things in anticipation of needing them. So for the fuel contracts, we'll kind of get into that at the actual thing, but there are some things were done to get that working. So as I mentioned, DLA works in supply chains, land and maritime, clothing, textiles, aviation, and distribution. So one of the main centers for this area, or for the East Coast, is New Cumberland, Pennsylvania. It's a huge facility in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, they have to decide. It's not altogether ultra modern, but you have to make that business case analysis decision. Where's the payback? The payback and making modernizations as far as getting ready for the payback for distribution. So one of the things that they struggle with, as do many organizations, as they talk about the Prepareathons and so forth, is storing and distributing supplies in a regular economy, which have gone to just in time, as you know, to try and save funds and so forth. And then you have to have a set aside for emergencies. So that's one of the things that they struggle with, or they constantly have to monitor, is how much do you keep for emergencies, and then how do you keep that supply fresh if it's consumables or if it's perishables, or even just reparables. Are they getting the annual updates that they need? Is the food being rotated so when you don't have an emergency and people get food and it says it's about to expire or it's expired? You try and explain to them that you can extend the life of it, but people don't want to hear that. They think the government's providing bad food if that happens. So DLA has become a major partner in the logistics with the military in reference to humanitarian disasters. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about at some point, and we'll do a little further of this, next slide, is how to do business with the government in general, or with DLA, and how do you become a supplier, or understand a little bit about how things are supplied by them. So there's a few guides. We have the one link there, and there's several other links where you have to decide what you do, how do you do it, and then you have to get various DUNS numbers and understand which category do you fit in: regular small business, large business, women-owned, disadvantaged, and so forth. You kind of just go through the various steps, and there's several guides and several organizations do this. But it's one of the things you can do to do business with DLA and understand what they do and how they provide for civilian disasters. And that'll be available to us at the conference. Herb, if you want to talk a little bit about Sandy.
Yep, Jeffrey, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, as you see before you now, this is the New Jersey coastline on the left before the hurricane hit, and what happened in the hours and days after the hurricane hit the Jersey shore. If we were to add another picture now, the post-Sandy picture, much of this area has been rebuilt. The boardwalks are back. Quite a recovery that many areas have gone, but not a full recovery. Many individuals are still without permanent homes, living in temporary shelter. Not all the infrastructure has been rebuilt. There's quite a lot that happens or needs to happen after a disaster has occurred. It doesn't get the same publicity, it doesn't get the same headlines that we see just before and during the disaster and right in the hours afterward, but those can have very long-lasting impacts. We'll talk more about that at APICS conference. So among the things that we'll also talk about is what was being done before the hurricane hit. Our Defense Logistics Agency, Jeffrey described, was working with the Red Cross, New York Federal Emergency Preparedness Team, the Army National Guard, pre-staging trucks at FEMA-designated areas in New Jersey, such as Joint Base McGuire, Dixon, and Lakehurst, and what then was occurred after Sandy in terms of how the various stakeholders are trying to work with each other. Some statistics we'll share include 62 million meals that were distributed by the National Guard and by others in terms of the immediate aftermath. So more of that we'll be able to share with all of you at the conference. So what are some of the lessons learned, and what can we take from a greater understanding of humanitarian logistics and the military's role in it? This research came to us and has been discussed at the Transportation Research Board by Dr. Jose Joaquin-Veras from RPI, who has done research in Japan, Haiti, and other areas on disasters. Among the things to look at and to be prepared is to engage and train collaborative aid networks before a disaster takes place. What is a collaborative aid network? It is a group of stakeholders, can engage both private and public stakeholders who will be sharing resources, who will be sharing information when a disaster does occur. In fact, there is a collaborative aid organization called ALAN, American Logistics Aid Network, which has various stakeholders including APICS, the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, CSCMP, work, the Warehouse Education Resource Council, TIA, Transportation Intermediaries Association. All of them professional associations working in the areas of logistics who share information and who share resources in the event of disaster. Those are who are on the webinar, and those who are interested can participate by contacting Alan or by APICS or any of the other organizations. And when disaster occurs, then what Alan seeks to do is bring all these networks together and share them and provide that information to local state authorities where there may have been disaster, and to see where indeed members of these associations can help. Obviously, our members have assets, distribution facilities, transportation facilities, knowledge, and so forth. And so by bringing that together, all of us who are members of APICS and the other organizations can truly participate and help through Alan. Alan, in fact, will be at APICS. They will have be in the exhibit area, and all of you are encouraged, if you're interested in this, to talk with them, engage in them, perhaps offer your resources or learn more from them in terms of how a collaborative aid network can respond in the event of a disaster. Next bullet point would be how to engage regional local logistics distribution sector. Relying solely on locals, as we say, is not a good idea. That's why we need to bring in other organizations. In the U.S., an important thing that we have to remember is that by law, based on a law called the Stafford Law, passed in 1988, it entails the process, the legal process for local, state, municipality to request aid from the national government. In the event when Katrina took place, or even Sandy, it was up to local authorities to request FEMA, as well as the military to be able to respond. That is by law, that is intended. So all responses start with first responders at the local state level, and then if the disaster is greater, they have the resources to manage. Then national and other resources are brought in at their request. So in terms of military or the regional capabilities, we have to understand that relying solely on locals is not a good idea because of such limited resources. Among things that therefore one does before the disaster, have contingency contracts, such as with construction companies, to be able to push away debris to open key roads. So those key roads be blocked up, it'll be extremely difficult to be able to respond immediately. So that's a priority that is done. These contracts therefore are done in ahead of disasters. And while our country may not have done these very well before Katrina and also earlier hurricanes in Florida, we have gotten much better at it. And the framework for this is what we discussed earlier for the national response framework. As I indicated, the research was done by Dr. Håkon Veras based on his research in Japan, Haiti, and elsewhere, and distributed through the Transportation Research Board, which is part of the National Academies of Science. So I think at this point we hopefully will have some questions, and we would love to be able to prepare questions. It has been a pleasure to do this. We're prepared for as many questions as John we have the time for, and I do again want to remind all that we will be available and look forward to an extended presentation at APICS in 2016, and hopefully we'll all be able to see you. So John, if I may turn it back to you.
Great, thank you very much, and Jeffrey. Great presentation, exceptional content that really speaks to some of the continual challenges that are out there, and how we as a community can marshal resources to respond to that. We would like to give the audience the opportunity to ask some additional questions. As a reminder, please click on the Q&A tab, which is located on the side of your screen, enter your question, and then click the Ask button. We'll give you a few moments to send in your questions. While we're doing that, I will go ahead and share. We have just added an additional session at conference. I'm pleased to share it with this group. Mr. Edward Case, who is the Vice Director of the Defense Logistics Agency, is scheduled to join us in Washington, D.C. He will lead a presentation which will take attendees through the DLA, or the Defense Logistics Agency Essentials. basically how DLA sources and provides nearly all of the consumable items for America's military forces that they need to operate, from food, fuel, and energy to uniforms, medical supplies, construction materials, and more. In addition, he'll provide attendees with an opportunity to hear about DLA's evolving approach to inventory management, its increasing role in worldwide humanitarian efforts, and its efforts to increase cyber resiliency in face of external threats. So again, we look forward to having Mr. Case join us in DC for that session, as well as Irv and Jeffrey again for an expanded version of this humanitarian logistics session. So with that, gentlemen, I'll tee up a few questions. Let's start with, here's one. What about PACOM, or PACOM, which is Hawaii and Guam? Can you speak to that?
Jeff, I think that's yours.
I guess what about it? What's the question? Sorry.
I think, Jeff, they're just looking for perhaps clarification in regards to the NorthCom, SouthCom, and how does this interplay with that group, or does it?
So Paytom has the largest area of responsibility. It's pretty big. So North America just covers North America properly, does not include Hawaii. Paytom is headquartered in Hawaii. And it's it's the biggest of all of the Paycoms, and I think it's bigger than many of them put together. It's the largest area, so that command commander would be in charge for that area. So any disaster in that area he'd be at the center of the humanitarian efforts and logistics to get people aid, whatever the issue was. They'd have their 4s and their 3s involved there. The J3 would be the lead for that operation. And then 4 obviously would be the J4 Logistics Engineering Director would be in support of that.
Great. Thank you, Jeffrey. Next question here. How many different types of disaster scenarios are typically being considered or reviewed at any one time?
Well, that's a current. So at one point, U.S. Northern Command was going through and they were making playbooks for different parts of the area of the country and for different natural disasters. They were trying to make playbooks. I'm not sure this is a couple of years ago. I'm not sure where they are on the status of that, but you have the huge fault line through the middle of the country. You've got a fault line in California. You've got various disasters, hurricane spots and areas where you might have a particular incident. So that's what they're trying to make playbooks for, to go for that. I'm not sure the number, though. I would guess in excess of a dozen they're working on, and probably trying to get to 24.
Great, thank you. Irv, this looks like a question for you. There appears to be differences and similarities between humanitarian logistics and non-disaster logistics. How would you evaluate such differences and similarities in demand planning, inventory classification, and the last mile?
Thank you for asking that question. There are many differences and similarities, and some of the areas you mentioned certainly are very visible. In demand planning, in traditional logistics and non-disaster logistics, we have various tools to be able to estimate what demand might be and to be able to respond. We have lots of data, we have lead time, and all those are working to us, are working to our advantage. In disaster logistics, we don't necessarily have that. We don't say that a disaster occurs just out of the blue. We have a certain amount of historical information. What we can do, therefore, is based on the past, we can estimate the potential type of demand there will be for certain kinds of products. But the data we have at the time the disaster occurs is far less, and so we've got to come up with various contingencies to be able to respond to that demand. So we know that people will need food products, people will need water products, but exactly where and exactly how much, we don't have that luxury in humanitarian logistics that we do in traditional logistics. In terms of inventory, traditional logistics, we have many, many different classes of inventory. Right? We know about the operating inventory, we know about excess inventory, we know about surplus inventory, and we certainly know about obsolete inventory. And we can determine those and work on plans to be able to reduce those categories to the extent we can. What type of classification do we have in humanitarian logistics? We have standby inventory. It is a great deal of what classifies that. We also know that based on how long we may have had inventory, it may have become obsolete. We have real difficulties in knowing whether it's obsolete at the time another disaster has occurred. This is a challenge that those humanitarian logistics are trying to solve. We've also had different ways of where we actually locate inventory. It has been a practice in the past where when we realized how short we were on inventory with Katrina and those disasters, to bring a huge amount of disasters to areas that we thought there something may occur. So FEMA would bring literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of bottles of bottled water into disaster areas. Okay, how long can we keep them? At some point, they become not just surplus inventory, but they may become obsolete inventory. So we have to begin to change our thinking about it, such that rather than having water being stored near potential disasters, we may have them with the suppliers. So we may try to work more in terms of drop shipments, maybe try to do more into direct movement from manufacturers or distributors to the actual site, so rather than government being a repository of inventory. So there are many more of those complications in how to classify inventory in humanitarian logistics than in traditional logistics. And in the last mile, well, in traditional logistics, we have a last mile. It may not be the easiest. Oftentimes that is the most difficult, but generally we at least have a road or we have some place to get to that last mile. In humanitarian logistics, we may not have that road. We may not have access to the last mile. We may not have a traditional way of being able to get to people in a disaster. So how do we overcome that? Well, one way is have the kind of equipment that often it's the military has, who can manage in those very difficult areas. So that may be one way to conquer the last mile. Or, as we can now see with technology, perhaps drone technology, unmanned aerial vehicles can become our go-to in terms of the last mile, whether it's a disaster in the U.S. or perhaps a disaster in halfway around the world. The ability to use that kind of technology to conquer that last mile. That has been the bane in humanitarian logistics and has not been the most efficient either in traditional logistics, but that's an area where humanitarian logisticians are working on to do, and it's a marked contrast between the two in what conditions we may have on the last mile. Thank you, John.
Great, thanks, Irv. Next question. How can the military's capabilities and ability to respond be best incorporated in the business continuity plans for either a business or a community? So what's that integration look like?
Well, one of the things they work on is have exercises to involve the committee, local government, tribes, and so forth involved as you do the exercises. Tabletops is always, or the early part of it is not actual stuff. And then you move into actual exercises. So for example, at Joint Forces Headquarters Command at Fort McNair, they had 3 to 4 exercises every year. And we'd invite people from Congress and staffers and so forth, as far as local government, the D.C. government, Virginia, Maryland, and so forth. They'd all come and be involved with that. They understand what we can do, how we can do it. One of the things we go over to old JFK Stadium and have some kind of biochemical kind of attack there. They could see how we do our decontamination and so forth. Have a busload of VIPs. They'd watch it there. We'd go over to, say, Fort Belvoir, and you'd watch a active shooter situation and how the military would solve that in conjunction with local authorities. Then you'd move on to some crass, some collapsed building, exploded building exercises where you go through and you try and save people in a collapsed building and that kind of rescue. So they understand what the military can do, what kind of stuff we practice with. And then, of course, as the local agencies have their drills and exercises, they invite the military to join them. So DC recently had an exercise with a crashed train, supply train crashed in the city. What would they do about that? A what-if scenario tabletop if there was a nuclear bomb in the city. How would they do evacuation? Just looking at the transportation aspect, it was on a timer kind of thing. So just exercises, understanding, people asking the questions, what would we do if this happened? This is how we would do it. People often come through with problems. Okay, well, if you do that, that means that we can no longer X, Y, Z, and they kind of work that out through the collaborative process.